Okay, good evening and welcome to the Gin and Tonic Show on this special guest appearance on a Tuesday. We're normally Friday, 8 p.m. UK time, but Ozzy has very graciously agreed to join us on a Tuesday. He's not able to easily make a Friday, so we've done a special show this Tuesday at 8 p.m. And as the title talks about, we're going to go through the justification for atheism. I've heard Ozzy talk about this on many Hangouts before elsewhere, and I really want to give him the opportunity to go through that. My colleague Stop Spamming and Abu will obviously ask a few questions. If you are watching and you have got a question, please in the chat highlight the Gin and Tonic Show. I'm showing it to you now in the chat. Type that in and then ask a question. That'll highlight it for us, and then we'll be able to ask Ozzy questions. I'm typically going to allow Ozzy to answer some of the questions and go through this, and then at certain points we'll ask questions. And we've had Ozzy on before, so I won't ask him to go through that again. If you want to know a little bit more about Ozzy, feel free to look back at one of our previous shows where Ozzy did go into that. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Ozzy. Ozzy, if you can start off by sharing with us your views on atheism versus non-theism, and currently your view just on how atheism is perceived out there.
Sure. Well, what I mean by atheism is the view or the position that there are no gods, that gods don't exist. Now, there's another view out there that atheism can be defined as what is more broadly called or understood in philosophical circles as non-theism, the mere lack of a belief. I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm interested in talking today about, or you're interested in talking today about my position, which is atheism in the narrow sense. So, in philosophical circles, we distinguish between atheism and agnosticism and theism. But the mere lack of a belief is not understood as atheism in most philosophical circles. Typically, atheism is understood as the view that there are no gods. It's a positive claim. It's anyone who thinks that there aren't any gods, as opposed to someone who's never heard of a god. That is a person who lacks a belief but doesn't affirm that there are no gods. That person is a non-theist. He or she isn't a theist. An agnostic is also a non-theist. It's someone who's perhaps on the fence. It's not someone who would say there is a God. It's not someone who would say that there isn't a God. It's someone who's perhaps completely undecided, perhaps thinks that there are good arguments on both sides and simply is inconclusive and can't make up his or her mind. Someone can be on the fence, for instance. So an agnostic would be a non-theist as well. And there are different types of agnosticism. There's the fence-sitter variety that I just described, but there are also agnostics who take a stronger position, who think that no one could ever be in a position to rationally assert that there is or isn't a God, either way. That's actually a fairly strong claim. That is not a person who's merely saying, I can't make up my mind given the evidence that I've heard, I'm torn on the matter. That's someone who thinks that no one has any business on either side affirming that there's a God or there isn't a God, right? So that's sometimes called the Huxleyan form of agnosticism. Aldous Huxley was the person who first coined the term agnosticism in the 1800s. So that species of agnosticism is also a form of non-theism. That person is a non-theist. And then there are other forms of non-theists. Another one is sometimes called igtheism or theological non-cognitivism. An igtheist or a theological non-cognitivist is a person who is of the view that the concept of gods are incoherent. Not that any particular claim about a God is incoherent, but that the entire discourse of theology is incoherent mumbo jumbo. So that the idea is that the discourse is so polluted, so confused, so meaningless that it's like people going around talking about how colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That's a grammatical sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, but it's completely meaningless. And if there was a whole discourse out there of people debating whether or not colorless green ideas could sleep furiously or not, I think we would be in our rights to say, well, those people are out to lunch. They don't know what they're talking about. They think they're talking about something meaningful, but in fact, it's meaningless. So a theological non-cognitivist isn't someone who thinks that there isn't a God, and it's not someone who thinks there is a God, and nor is it someone like an agnostic who's undecided. It's someone who thinks that the discourse is so polluted that nobody can even get as far as being an atheist or an agnostic or a theist, that the discourse is literally meaningless. That's a theological non-cognitive position. That too, I think, could be fairly characterized as a species of non-theism. But what I'm interested in talking about is atheism. Atheism understood traditionally as the view that there aren't any gods. And I am of that view. I am of the view that probably there aren't any gods. One way to understand this is that it is a provisional view. One doesn't have to affirm that all gods are impossibilities, right? I can't demonstrate that any and all gods don't exist in the sense that they're impossibilities. But I think that there are reasons for thinking that no gods exist. And so provisionally, pending evidence to the contrary, I am of the view that all gods are made up. And in fact, I think within the atheist community, most people who call themselves atheists, whether they identify atheism as the positive assertion that there's no God or a mere lack of belief, most people who self-identify as atheists are in fact of the opinion that gods are just made up. In fact, you will sometimes hear people say, by atheism, I merely mean a lack of belief, but I think gods are made up. Gods are fictions. Gods are imaginary. Gods are human inventions. All of those are claims about reality. Those are all claims that affirm that gods aren't real. So if you like to define atheism as a mere lack of a belief, if you like to equate atheism with non-theism, that's fine. But you might also be the kind of non-theist who actually thinks gods don't exist, in which case you're an atheist not under the broader umbrella of non-theism. You are actually an atheist in the stricter, narrower sense of making a claim about reality. You're making the claim that definitely or possibly or most likely gods don't exist. And so I'm in the camp of those who thinks that gods don't exist. And I think that there are reasons that one can give. One doesn't have to simply hide the ball here and push the burden of justification only on the theist. You can actually go as far as saying, you know what? I think gods are BS. I think they're all made up. I think they're all fictions. I think we came up with them. And here are my reasons why. And that, I think, is actually a more honest and forthright way of being an atheist. If it is in fact your view that gods don't exist, you shouldn't shy away from trying to give a justification or a rational warrant for thinking there are no gods. After all, you can't go around believing, never mind what you would say, you can't go around believing in your heart of hearts that gods are made up and gods don't exist unless you have a reason to do so. Because if you're doing that, then you are in fact not possessing a rational belief in thinking that there aren't any gods. So I think most atheists are of the view that there aren't any gods. And I think most of them have reasons, but very few atheists are actually particularly good at articulating that explicitly. And they tend to sort of pull back and argue for a species of agnosticism, which is not really their position. And so I'm always encouraging my fellow atheists to sort of take up the sword, if you will, and argue for their atheism, why they think there aren't any gods. What I'm going to present here are reasons that will probably strike most atheists as quite familiar, but perhaps not having heard it said this way. But I'm hoping to be able to say it succinctly enough that they can present those reasons themselves in dialogue with other people, including other theists who challenge their atheism.
Yes, and I guess one of the reasons I put it to you that because I was what you would have termed a lack theist, and obviously you can I think you have described it, but you could go into a little bit more detail perhaps. But I was persuaded by what I heard from you, and one of the reasons I think atheists / lactivists would take that position is they think that theists are making the positive claim, and the moment they then have to justify their beliefs or non-beliefs, as some people might call it, now they're taking their eye off the ball, or they're allowing the theist to sidestep their responsibility for giving the reasons why they believe in a God. What would be your response to somebody who says, hey, I prefer to say I lack a belief because that way I don't have to articulate anything, and I'm not going to allow them to shift the burden, quote unquote, away from justifying their belief in a God?
Well, I would fully support anyone who says, I don't want to let a theist shift the burden. I think that's true. That's correct, and they shouldn't. But you shouldn't shirk that burden yourself when it comes to your own position. Remember, it's not true that in a discussion, only one person has the burden of proof. We have this expression, burden of proof, in English, but it comes from the Latin onus probandum. And onus probandum gets translated as burden of proof. But what it means is the burden of evidence, the burden of justification. Now, what determines who has a burden of justification and what that burden is isn't who has what position, but rather who has a position, period. If there are three people in a room and they are each espousing or holding three different positions, if they are talking about their positions, they have to warrant or justify their positions, whatever they are. That doesn't get anybody else off the hook. So if I am talking to a theist, for instance, and a theist says there's a God, well, if I haven't said what my position is, I don't have to defend my atheism. It's not the subject of conversation. We're talking about his or her theism. I expect the theist to defend his or her position. But if in the course of the discussion, I'm asked, what is your position, Ozzy? Or if I volunteer, well, I think gods are made up. I don't think they're real. Well, now, once that happens, now my position is on the table and we can decide, well, we can have two debates. We can debate yours and mine, or just yours, just mine, or we can debate both simultaneously. But the point is, what determines whether or not you have a burden of justification is not the other person's position. It's what you believe to be true. What you take to be true, what you think is the case, that's what defines whether or not you have a burden of justification. And it's the ability to satisfy or discharge that burden of justification, to provide rational warrant for what you think is the case, never mind what anybody else thinks is the case. You don't need another person in the room to have a burden of justification, right? If you want to claim that your position is rational, there has to be a rationale for it. It doesn't make sense to say, my position is rational by default. Something can't be rational without reasons. That's antithetical to skepticism. So if you think that the belief that gods are made up is a rational position, surely you have reasons for thinking that. And that's what you want to do. You don't want to play hide the ball with your position and adopt a weaker definition of your own position. You don't want to simply say, oh, I'm not really an atheist in the sense of thinking that there are no gods. I don't want to say that, because then I'll have to explain why I think there aren't any gods. And you want to avoid, some people want to avoid doing that. And what they do instead is they define themselves as lacking theism. I merely lack theism. But then your position is now undefined. You are now indistinguishable from an agnostic of the Huxleyan sort, a fence-sitter agnostic, a person who's never heard of a god, a child who hasn't been taught about gods yet, a theological non-cognitivist. All of these are non-theist positions. These are all positions where theism is lacking, right? So is atheism. I am also a lack theist. That is, I lack theism. I am a non-theist. But atheism is one species of lack theism, or one species of non-theism. And so if you are going to be honest with your interlocutors in a discussion and demand that they stand up and shoulder the burden of their position, you should be willing to do the same when you're asked what your position is. Right? You don't have to necessarily volunteer what your position is if you just want to hear and examine their position. But if your position gets brought up, or you decide to start talking about your position, you better be prepared to offer some reasons why you think that atheism is true. And it's no good to hide your position and simply lump it into some umbrella, some class of non-theistic positions, right? Because if a person says, look, I want to know what your position is on the God question. Do you think there's a God, or do you think there isn't a God? Are you undecided? Do you think the whole discourse is so polluted that all God talk is meaningless and that atheists and theists and agnostics are all out to lunch? Is that your position? Like, I want to know what your position is. And if you say, I'm a non-theist, that's not telling people what your position is, right? And that's certainly not defending what your position is, whatever it is, right? And imagine if you came to me and you said, Ozzy, what's your position? And I said, I'm a non-agnostic. You would be scratching your head going, okay, you're not an agnostic, so you're some kind of Gnostic. Gnostic with respect to what? Like theism? Like, are you claiming to know that there's a God? Are you claiming to know that there's no God? Like, what? Describing yourself as a non-agnostic doesn't tell me what you are. It doesn't tell me if you're a theist or an atheist. It doesn't tell me if you're a theological non-cognitivist. It just tells me what you're not. But I want to hear what your position is. So I think as a condition of public assertability, and as a condition of having rational warrant for your position, you should be able to offer some reasons. Now, I think in point of fact, most atheists who I would say hide behind the label of lack theism are in fact atheists and do in fact have reasons, but are not always particularly willing to defend them. And I think it's because a lot of atheists have drunk a certain bit of Kool-Aid here that comes from theism. A lot of theists demand of atheists that if you're going to claim to be an atheist, you have to claim that you can prove there aren't any gods. And that, I think, is a mistake on the theist part. And a lot of atheists have drunk that Kool-Aid and think, I can't go so far as to say, I honestly believe that gods don't exist unless I can prove that no God exists. But you only have that as your burden of justification, of proving that any and all gods are impossible, if it is your view that any and all gods are impossibilities. But that's not what's required to be an atheist. To be an atheist, you just have to think that, probably all gods don't exist. Probably no God exists, right? And if that's your view, that it's rational and reasonable to think that all of the gods are made up, then and you can defend that, then you have rational warrant for your atheism. You don't have to go so far as to prove that something is impossible to think that it's untrue. And let me just give you a quick analogy that I can elaborate on later. But I mean, consider Bigfoot. I don't think Bigfoot is real. I think Bigfoot is made up. I think Bigfoot or Sasquatch, this monster, this sort of man-ape creature that wanders the Canadian woods, allegedly, that I think is a complete fiction from start to finish, okay? I can't demonstrate to a certainty that Bigfoot is impossible. Indeed, maybe Bigfoot is real. It's possible. It's logically possible that such a creature might exist. It's not a contradiction to affirm that there's a creature like that in the Canadian woods. Maybe there is one, okay? Maybe there is a tiny population of such rare creatures, okay? Maybe the cryptozoologists are right, okay? But that doesn't mean that I think it's true. I think it's false, and I have reasons for thinking it's false. I have reasons for thinking it's more likely to be false than true about Bigfoot's existence. So consequently, I am an atheist, if you will, with respect to Bigfoot. I'm not undecided about Bigfoot. I've made up my mind. Bigfoot doesn't exist. I'll only change my mind if I see actually good evidence for Bigfoot's existence. And it's the same with God, okay? It's the same with the Christian God, the Muslim God, the Jewish God, the gods of Hinduism, the gods of the ancient Greeks, all gods that I've ever heard of. I think that they are all made up. And I can't prove, well, for some, I think you can establish that some gods can't exist, and we can talk about that. But I can't prove that every conception of a deity is an impossibility, right? But if I have reasons for thinking that they don't exist, that's sufficient to warrant my atheism. And I think that there are reasons for that, and we can talk about that. But atheists need to sort of guard against the very sly move of being told that you can only be an atheist if you can prove that any and all gods are impossibilities. You only have to discharge that burden if that's your claim. Well, it's not my claim that any and all gods are impossibilities. Some gods, I think, are impossibilities. Some gods merely don't exist. Bigfoot's not an impossibility. He just ain't real. And that's how I feel about Yahweh and all of the other gods.
Ozzy, can I just ask you a question?
Sure.
Is there any reason to treat gods differently to, let's say, Cinderella? Because for me, Bigfoot is still too close to reality, but Cinderella definitely is not. Is there any reason to treat them differently?
Well, not in principle. I mean, these are all hypothetical beings. They're all put forward as hypothetical. I could name a person. I could name, for instance, my cousin Bob. Okay, So Bob Stanfield is my cousin, and I start talking about Bob Stanfield, okay? Now, as a matter of fact, Bob Stanfield, my cousin, doesn't exist. I don't have a cousin, Bob Stanfield, okay? But I have just put forward this person, okay? I've just posited this person for the purposes of this example. Well, look, you can think of Cinderella that way. You can think of Yahweh that way. You can think of Bigfoot that way. You can think of Batman that way. There are some of these posits that are widely understood and agreed to be fictional creations. Cinderella, right? is widely understood to be a fictional creature, a creature of literature, okay? Like Batman is a creature of the comic book genre, okay? And I think that Yahweh is a fictional creature of the mythical genre, okay? But they can all be treated the same in that you can consider what the concept is, examine its implications, and then ask yourself, what evidence would we expect to find if this creature existed, or this being existed, this person or whatever it is existed, and then set about looking for that evidence. And then consider the origins of, where did this person come from? Where did this story of this person come from? Where did we first hear about Batman? When did we first hear about Cinderella? When did we first hear about Bigfoot? When did we first hear about Yahweh? And then look into the origins and go, there's something fishy about some of these things, okay? So in the case of Cinderella and Batman, we have some sense of the origin of where these tales originated from that signals to us, these are fictional beings. In fact, in the case of Batman, we know who invented Batman, when Batman first came to be known in a comic book, and so forth, right? And we can do that with many hypothetical or posited beings. So a person, a real person, is a positive being for the purposes of discussion. A literary character is a positive being for the purposes of discussion. A god is a posited being, right? These are all hypothetical beings while we're having the discussion about whether or not they exist. They can all be treated sort of as hypothetical beings, and then we can evaluate the evidence to find out whether or not such a being exists. I could, for instance, start talking about my wife. Now, you people here don't know me very well. You don't know whether I'm married or not. As a matter of fact, I do have a wife. I could start giving you information about her, and you could look into videos by me. I could volunteer information that would establish that I, in fact, do have a wife, that she's a real flesh and blood person with certain features and characteristics, and so forth. So all of these beings, I think, can be treated on face value. You don't have to sort of dismiss any being a priori before examining the evidence. But you can nevertheless know something about the origin of a being or a person or a hypothetical being or a positive being that gives you reason to be suspicious. And in the case of things like Bigfoot and mermaids and Batman and Yahweh, the alarms start to go off. There's something fishy about the origin of these hypothetical beings, and there's something particularly distinct in the lack of evidence where we should expect to find evidence for these beings that signals to us these are probably not real beings. These are invented creatures.
How do you see this? Because this still intrigues me, and I'm a little bit shocked to hear you say this with the agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
I work on the assumption that Gnostic and agnostic are based in the realm of knowledge. If we look at epistemology, then this is in the realm of knowledge, and atheist or theist is in the realm of belief. So for me, nobody can know or cannot know, and therefore agnostic is a superfluous term.
Yeah, I don't agree with that position, because I don't agree with that way of sort of carving up the pie in terms of belief and knowledge. The term theism, I mean, this is going to sound weird. A lot of people have a sort of a weird idea. They think that there was this term theism, and then atheism was coined as sort of an antithesis to theism, and then agnosticism defines a type of theism. You're either a Gnostic theist or a Gnostic atheist, or an agnostic theist or an agnostic atheist. That entire history that people have in their minds about the origin of these words is incorrect. In point of fact, and you don't have to take my word for it, you can just look it up on Wikipedia, the word atheism was coined before the word theism. It seems odd, right? How did that happen? Well, there's a peculiar history about the origin of that word. It originated in French, first of all. But atheism or atheism was coined first, and they were hearkening back to the Greek. And the word atheism in ancient Greek, atheos, was applied, believe it or not, to people like Christians, who were definitely not atheists. They were theists. Christians were theists. But they didn't believe in the right gods, and so they were called atheists by Romans. So, I mean, you shouldn't look at the etymology of a word and assume that that exhausts the meaning of the word and its range of applicability. Now, in point of fact, for centuries now, in modern languages, the word atheism has been used to refer to people who affirm that there isn't a God. Okay, it had nothing to do with whether or not you claim to know there was a God or not. I mean, consider this. You can be a theist whether you claim to know that there's a God or not. I mean, most theists out there don't claim to know there's a God. Most theists think, yeah, I believe there's a God. I think probably it makes more sense to think that there's a God than not. They're still theists. They don't have to know that there's a God to be properly labeled as a theist. A theist is anyone who thinks that there's a God. And similarly, an atheist is not someone who can prove that there is no God. It can be provisional. And so an atheist is anyone who thinks that there isn't a God. Well, what about the word agnostic? Well, the word agnostic was coined in the 1850s or 60s, I believe, by Thomas Henry Huxley, a contemporary of Darwin, actually. And he coined the term to refer to people who were neither a theist nor an atheist. Right? There were people out there who are, just as there are today, millions of them, who are undecided. I don't claim to know that there aren't any gods.
But how can you be undecided?
What's that?
How can you be undecided?
Because well, let me give you an example.
It's odd or even, but you can't be in the middle.
Right, exactly. But now watch this. Here, let me hold this out here. I'm holding here a glass of single malt scotch, okay? How many atoms of alcohol are there in this, right? Or let's say molecules, aren't any atoms of alcohol, but how many molecules of alcohol are there in this? I don't know.
15.
Okay, at any given moment though, there are going to be either an even number or an odd number of alcohol molecules in this glass of single malt scotch. Now, which is it? Is it even or odd? Are you an evenist or an oddist?
Exactly. That's what I said. I mean, this is the whole point. You can't make up your mind.
Right, exactly. So there are many questions where the only rational position, such as this one, is I can't make up my mind. I don't have any information one way or another to decide whether the number of alcohol molecules in this glass is even or odd. And consequently, I will be undecided.
No, but that doesn't work.
No, wait, let me finish. Let me finish. So what happens is there are people in the world who are undecided. Now, but you might think, look, their reasons for being undecided are terrible, okay? But nevertheless, if by their lights, they cannot come to a conclusion because they think that some of the arguments for God are pretty good, but they also know some of the defeaters for some of those arguments. And they've also heard arguments for why gods probably don't exist. And they think some of those arguments are pretty good. They can just find themselves unable to come to a conclusion. They know that, look, either there's a God or there isn't. Just like either the number of alcohol molecules in this glass is either even or odd. But you don't have to decide, right? You should only ever say X is the case or X is not the case if you have reasons for thinking one or the other. And in instances where you cannot make up your mind, you should just say, I haven't made up my mind. It has nothing to do with knowledge. Supposing I believed for terrible reasons that the number of alcohol molecules in this glass was an even number, okay? All right, supposing I thought that there were 20 million molecules in here of alcohol and 20 million is an even number, okay? I would say, well, I'm an evenist, okay? Now, I might have terrible reasons for thinking that, all right? Perhaps I consulted a Ouija board or something like that. I have a terrible, manifestly bad reason for thinking that. I would still be an evenist, okay? And if you said, well, Ozzy, that doesn't make any sense, it's terrible, by your lights, you should remain an agnostic, undecided, inconclusive on the question, even though I have come to a rash conclusion. So now you might, on the God question, think, look, there's no good reason to be a theist. And you might find the reasons against believing in God stronger. And so you might think everyone ought to, rationally speaking, conclude that there isn't a God. Okay, there will be theists who think the other way, of course. Well, somebody's wrong in this instance, okay? But for any individual who is genuinely undecided, that's what the word agnosticism is for. The word agnostic isn't about knowledge. I know that the root of the word has to do with gnostic, right? But really what Huxley was trying to coin there was people's commitment. Are you committed to one or the other? when there are people, just as there were then, there are millions today who are simply undecided, who say, is there a God or not? I don't know. And by I don't know, they don't mean that they lack certainty or that they can't prove it. They mean I don't know in the sense of being inconclusive. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Supposing I said, listen, let us go out to supper, you and I, tonight. We can either have Chinese food, Japanese food, or Mexican food. What do you want to do? And you go, oh, I don't know. Now, you're not telling me that you lack knowledge. What you're saying is you're undecided. You're inconclusive. Very often when we say, I don't know, what we're saying, what we're not saying is that we lack knowledge. Very often what we're saying is, I'm undecided, I'm inconclusive. In fact, most of the time when people say they don't know when they're given options, they are actually not signaling a lack of conviction or certainty, but rather inconclusiveness or ambivalence on the subject. So the words I don't know are not always an epistemic concept. That expression I don't know is idiomatic language. Sometimes it's epistemic, meaning they're talking about knowledge, but many times it's psychological. They're simply describing their psychological state of inconclusiveness or indecisiveness. And so when Huxley coined the term, he was actually talking about people who are of the opinion that no one should be deciding one way or the other because the question was could not be resolved. And if it could not be resolved, nobody had any business affirming theism or atheism. That was Huxley's position. Okay. And then, of course, there are people who are just fence sitters who are not Huxleyan agnostics who affirm that the question is undecidable, but they themselves have not yet come to any decision about it. Okay. So I think that's the sort of the proper way to understand agnosticism as it has traditionally been used. That's why when you go out on the street and you talk to a person and you say, do you think that there's a God or not? If they say, well, I haven't made up my mind on that, and you say, oh, so you're a kind of atheist, they'll go, no, I'm not a kind of atheist. An atheist is someone who thinks there's no God, right? Those people are actually, who say that are, in their naivete, are actually better capturing how those terms, atheist and agnostic, have traditionally been used. So I think it's perfectly sensible for a person to say, I'm an agnostic. That is, I am undecided when they can't decide. If by their lights they don't have grounds, rational warrant by their own lights to conclude one way or the other, they should not conclude one way or the other. It would be intellectually dishonest of them to affirm theism or atheism. They should just simply say, I'm undecided, and that can be provisional. And it very often is temporary, but not always. Some people go through their whole lives unable to make up their minds.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm just too radical, I suppose.
I think there's a question here from one of our very smart listeners and a colleague of mine. Does the census divinatis constitute evidence? And can we say, and if so, can we say the same about census non-divitatis?
Well, that's interesting. That's clever. Okay. Well, for those who don't know what the census divinitatis is, this is a Christian concept, actually. And it is the view that there is in everyone a sense of the divine. That is an awareness of the divine. Okay, it is a capacity to apprehend or experience God. And according to some flavors of Christianity, everyone possesses this sense, and as such, everyone really in their heart of hearts knows that there's a God, and so believes that there is a God, because they can have a direct experience of God. Other people construe the sensus divinitatis a little more weakly. They think it is a capacity to, in principle, experience God, but not everyone has experienced God. So that's a sort of a weaker version of it. Okay, so that's the sensus divinitatis. I think that is BS. I think that there's no such thing as the sensus divinitatis. I don't think that there's a sensus divinitatis any more than there's a sensus bigfootus. I think that is completely confabulated. The idea that there is some psychological or spiritual capacity within us to apprehend the divine, but that somehow isn't articulated, it sounds like exactly the kind of thing that is born of desperate desire for reasons and evidence, right? We don't speak of a sensus anything akin to a sensus divinitatis in any other area of our lives. You know, when there's reasons for thinking and there's evidence for thinking that something exists, we point to the reasons and the evidence. It is only in cases such as the divine where there just really isn't any good evidence on offer that is communicable, that people will then try to suggest that there is something private and incommunicable and ineffable within all of us that is sufficient to rationally warrant a belief. That to me seems like a move born of desperation. So I don't think that there's any such sense whatsoever. That seems completely fatuous as an argument. There would be no way for that person to know if this inner sense or feeling or experience or whatever is in fact occasioned or caused by the divine in the first place. How are they able to check that? They have no way of knowing that, right? For all they know, it's not the God they think. For all they know, it's an infernal satanic being that is occasioning their belief in some non-existent deity, right? Or perhaps it's just something that they're imagining. And I don't think that there's a sensus non-divinitatis either. I don't think that there's anything in us that gives us a sense of the absence of God that is private and incommunicable and ineffable. I don't think that private experiences are the sorts of things that are going to actually rationally warrant something as metaphysically extravagant as a God. Remember, if I'm in pain, if I bump my elbow and I feel a sharp pain in my elbow, and I say, well, there's a private experience. You're not feeling it, but I'm feeling it. No one's going to deny that I'm in pain, right? Well, someone might try to deny that I'm in pain, but it's not going to convince me. I know when I'm in pain. But the pain just refers to itself. It doesn't refer beyond itself. But if I have an experience and I say, oh, this experience that I'm having, I don't know what to compare it to. I'm going to attribute it to God. Well, wait a minute. On what basis am I attributing it to God? Right? Presumably, there has to be something that connects that experience to the divine for me to rationally be warranted in attributing that experience to the divine. And that's what's wrong with this idea of a sensus divinitatis. Some people want to say that there's this experience that is self-authenticating. Well, says you, right? And never mind trying to convince me why I ought to believe you. Why do you believe you? Why do you, who posit the sensus divinitatis, why do you believe that this experience or feeling that you have actually constitutes evidence for the divine? How did you establish this connection? You didn't. You don't have a procedure for this, and because it's incommunicable, you can't even test with anybody else. All you can do is sort of talk to other people and ask them if they have a similar sense, and they'll say yes. But if it's incommunicable, there's no way for you to compare whether or not you're feeling the same thing. All we have is, see, here's something else. Sort of getting back to the idea of there's something fishy in the story that should set off your spider sense here, that something is fishy here. This idea of a sensus divinitatis is an idea that gets invented in the Middle Ages. Okay, it hasn't always been there. So this conception has an origin story. We actually know something about the origin of this, and then it starts to spread. And it spreads within Christianity, which is why we don't find it heard so much in other religions, although it does get picked up and parroted in other religions. Right? But we hear primarily of it in one religion and in only certain strains. Calvinists particularly love to talk about the sensus divinitatis, for instance. So I think once you know something about the origin of an idea and where it came from, it can give you reason for doubt. It's not reason for dismissing it outright. You don't want to commit the genetic fallacy and say, well, I know how it originated, therefore it can't be true. But when you know the origin of something, it allows you to put it in a class with other things. And if all those other things are BS, then you can go, oh, wait a minute, now I have some prima facie reason for thinking something is not right with this. So for instance, if I first hear that a certain character that I've heard talked about for a long time was first introduced in a comic book, all of a sudden I have a reason to think, oh, maybe this is a made-up being. Maybe this is just a character in a comic book. Why? Because other characters in comic books are typically fictitious. Although sometimes in comic books there are references to real people, right? So it doesn't settle the case, but you can end up putting things into a class that gives you reason to suspect that that thing doesn't exist. And I think gods, like Bigfoot, belong in a certain class. Bigfoot belongs in the class of things along with unicorns and mermaids, and wendigos and Manasukan and all kinds of other fictive creatures, none of which have ever been demonstrated to exist. Okay, and so right off the bat, you ought to think, I'm going to be skeptical about that. My BS detectors are ringing, and I think gods are the same way. And I think the census divinitatis is the same thing too. This is a capacity with no analogs in the rest of our lives. Right? There's nothing else epistemologically that functions this way. But we are expected to take seriously the claim that everybody has within them a capacity to detect the divine that is incommunicable and ineffable, and there's no way to compare it and arrive at any kind of intersubjective agreement about it. Yet we're supposed to trust it, and we're supposed to trust that it points to the thing that we say that it points to. This seems to me to be completely fatuous as a reason for believing. And so even when I was a theist, and I was a theist as a young man, for instance, even when I was a theist, I never found that a compelling argument. And I can remember articulating a version of that, not in its Latin expression, but in English. And I remember articulating that, and I can remember being a little ashamed of myself when I did it, because I knew I wasn't actually describing any particular experience or feeling or way of thinking. It was really just a hunch.
Cool. Okay, I think let's move on then to the reasons for you being an atheist. So if I or Stops or Abu here were theists, and we ask you the question, okay, Ozzy, so you're an atheist. Why are you an atheist? What would be your views on that then?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would do is I would point to the lack of evidence where one ought to expect to find evidence. Okay, that's part of what it means to discharge your burden in this instance. Okay, so for instance, if the Christian God were true, or the Jewish God were true, as described, okay, then this God, Yahweh, is responsible for a global flood, for instance. He's responsible for the captivity of Jews by Egyptians, these Jews being held in slavery, a mass exodus out of Egypt, an army being swallowed up in the Red Sea, all kinds of things. There is evidence we should find. We should find evidence of a global flood. We should find evidence in Egyptian records of this captivity of Jews, of the mass escape, of the Pharaoh and his sons and his army being washed away while in pursuit of the fleeing Jews, for instance, right? We find no such evidence, right? So an absence of evidence where you ought to expect to find it is evidence of absence. Now, this is an important point, because you will often hear theists say, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Now, I'm going to tell you to the contrary. Oh, yes, it is. An absence of evidence is not a proof of absence, but an absence of evidence is evidence of absence. What else could be an evidence of absence other than the absence of evidence, right? When you say absence of evidence is evidence of absence, you have to emphasize the word evidence. An absence of evidence is evidence of absence. It's not proof of absence, but it is evidence. It does count towards the conclusion that this being probably doesn't exist, or that this thing doesn't exist, or that this cause doesn't exist, or this principle doesn't exist, whatever it is you're talking about. This is how we proceed all the time. When you expect to find evidence for something and you don't find it, that's a reason to think that it wasn't there at all. It's not proof. You could have misunderstood what the evidence ought to be. You might be mispredicting what ought to be there. The evidence might be somewhere else that you haven't sought yet. That's possible. So you haven't proven that it isn't there. Let me expand upon this with a Bigfoot example, okay? If Bigfoot were real, if there was a species of large ape-like humanoids running around in the Canadian woods, what would we find? Okay, well, we should find by now a specimen. By now, in the hundreds of years that people have been living in Canada, and collecting fauna and doing taxonomy, right? Not to mention the thousands or tens of thousands of years that Native Americans lived here, okay? Just in the last few centuries, where we have been systematically collecting evidence of all the flora and fauna in the country, we should have found a specimen by now, right? One of them should have been hit by a car or a truck crossing a highway at night. One of them should have been shot by a hunter. One of them would have frozen to death in a harsh winter, starved to death, been afflicted with parasites, injured, drowned in a river, right? You know, something. We by now should have found a carcass, if not a living specimen, a dead specimen. We should have found their bones. We find the bones of giant sloths and mastodons and giant beavers and saber-toothed tigers here in Canada, right? These all existed millions, tens, and hundreds of millions of years ago, some of them, if you include dinosaurs. No bones of these Bigfoot, right? These are all things we should find. We should find hair. We should find stool samples, right, with DNA. Hunters and hikers and campers are out there putting up their trail cams in the Canadian woods. They take pictures of moose and foxes and wolves and marmots and chipmunks all day and night, year round. Never a Bigfoot. What evidence do we find for Bigfoot? Blurry, grainy video, photographs, footprints that never lead back to an animal. Any hunter or tracker will tell you, if you find tracks and you keep following them, you will often, not in every case, but often, you will find the creature that made them. You will find its lair, you will find its den, or you will find the creature. This never happens with Bigfoot. In other words, we don't find the evidence that we should find, and what evidence we do find in the case of Bigfoot is exactly the kind of evidence that you can easily fake. Photography, bad video, casts of footprints or footprints that could easily have been faked. All of the evidence is easily faked evidence, okay? But what we don't find is the DNA, the hair, the stool, the body, the living specimen. None of that do we ever find. All we get are lots and lots of tales by people who purport to have known someone who saw Bigfoot, or purport to have seen Bigfoot themselves, or had some kind of encounter, or heard him, or something like that, okay? So an absence of evidence where we expect to find it is a reason to think that this thing doesn't exist in the first place, which is why I don't think that there's a Bigfoot. I can't prove that Bigfoot's an impossibility, but it's not my claim that Bigfoot's an impossibility. My claim is that Bigfoot is not an actuality, right? I just think Bigfoot's not actual. I'm not claiming he's impossible, right? I'm just claiming he's not actual. And I need to defend that. And the reasons, the rational reasons for thinking that Bigfoot doesn't exist is that all the evidence we would expect to find isn't there. And it's similar with all of these Old Testament stories about a global flood and a flight out of Egypt. Meanwhile, there are certain stories like the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, which is borne out by evidence. That much we can believe, that much we know is true. That did happen. Okay. Was there a King David? Yeah, there was a King David. It doesn't look like he was the big deal that he's made out to be in the Old Testament, but it appears there was a King David. It might have been a small tribe, but there appears to have been a King David. Okay. So some of the story is true. In the story of Jesus, for instance, could Jesus have existed? Yeah, of course he might have existed, right? But what about this story in the Gospel of Matthew where when Jesus is crucified, the veil is torn, there's a darkness at noon, there's an earth-shaking earthquake, and the tombs of the Jewish saints open up and they come out of their tombs and walk around in the city of Jerusalem. Did that happen? What evidence would we expect to find? Someone would have written about it. Someone other than the one Gospel of Matthew. None of the other Gospels even write about these events, right? You would expect at least another Gospel writer to write about it. But no other Gospel writer but Matthew writes about the zombie uprising of Jewish saints coming out of their tombs, right? Surely some Jewish person would have said, Dear Martha, in a letter, you won't believe what happened in Jerusalem today. Old Uncle Saul came back, right? Like something, right? I mean, the Romans would have been mighty interested in such an eventuality. Someone would have written about it, right? There are no contemporary accounts of anything in connection with Jesus's resurrection, appearances, his miraculous birth, any of his miracles, none of it, right? There's really nothing written about Jesus at all by any contemporaries. So all of this is an absence of evidence where you would expect to find it. So that's the first reason. The first reason I think that these gods don't exist is I don't find evidence where I would expect to find it. And what I have just told you here about Yahweh, which I think would have affected the three Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, could be multiplied for other gods and other religions. We just don't find the evidence where we would expect to find it. Okay.
Before you carry on then, Ozzy, a
Please.
couple of things. One is, I think your microphone is just brushing against your collar, so every time we just hear it tapping there. I don't know if you can just move it a little bit away from your collar there. The other question was, so you've given those reasons there. Somebody in the comments, and I actually hear this from some theists as well, what about consciousness? Surely consciousness points towards a conscious creator, because consciousness, well, that's something very special, and that's different from what you're talking about.
There's a number of things wrong with that line of argument. But the first thing I would say is I would grant that consciousness is very special. It is a weird phenomenon. Okay, we don't have an explanation for it. There are many mental features of our mental lives that are so far unexplained by our materialistic, physicalistic, scientific ontology. We don't know how the capacity for the mind, well, first of all, consciousness is a mystery. We don't know how it arises. Okay, we know that it does arise. We know it's connected to the brain, but we don't know how the brain actually generates this. I'm of the opinion that brains cause minds, but I'm not of the opinion that we are even close to understanding how that works. That remains a mystery. But there are other features of the mental causation, for instance, deliberative will, rationality, intentionality, subjectivity. There's all kinds of features of the mental, of things that are characteristically mental features that we don't know how to reduce or explain in terms of lower level neurological phenomena. Perhaps someday we will, but presently we don't, and I'm not optimistic that we will anytime soon. And I have other philosophical reasons why I'm not optimistic, but nevertheless, I do think brains cause minds, but I don't think we're anywhere close to solving that mystery. So there is a mystery there, but positing a God doesn't solve that mystery. This is absolutely a God of the gaps argument. You have this mystery. How do brains cause minds, or how does consciousness arise, or why does it exist at all? Why does it have the features that it does? Oh, I know. I'll just posit it that a God does it. Well, that's a God of the gaps, right? That is an argument from ignorance. I don't know why this is the case, therefore God did it. So that, I think, is not a good argument. That is a sort of a paradigm case of a God of the gaps argument and argumentum ad ignorantium. An argument from ignorance, an argument born of ignorance. This is not to say that you are ignorant if you advance this argument. It just means that what you are doing is you are appealing to a piece of ignorance, to some hole in our knowledge, and saying, therefore, it's this particular thing, without knowing how that particular thing could do that. If a God exists, we have no idea how a God could do this either. I think that the prospect of showing how something supernatural causes consciousness, I mean, that's even more hopeless than trying to explain things in terms of neurons at this point. So how it happens, we don't know, but God talk doesn't help at all. That just compounds one mystery with an even deeper, less well-defined mystery.
Fair enough. Okay, cool. Let's move on then.
Okay. Another way that I would argue for atheism is that many God concepts contain internal contradictions. That is, they are logically incoherent. That is, within the specific concept of a God or a category of gods, there is some contradiction. Okay, and that is a good argument for provisionally rejecting the existence of something. I mean, if you can point out that something, some concept contains a contradiction, you know that concept, as understood, can't exist. It's like talking about a square circle. If someone says, I have an object here, and I say, oh, what shape is it? And they say, oh, it's a square circle. Look, I don't know what object they're holding, but I know that the way they've described it isn't right. So the square circle thing in their hand that they're saying they have in their hand, it doesn't exist, not as described. Okay, so let me give you an example, for instance, from religious theology. We often hear that God is absolutely and perfectly just. This God is always just. He is unsurpassingly just. But we're also told that he is unsurpassingly merciful, that this God is merciful. But wait a minute, there's a problem with these two concepts. To be just, it means, especially if you're in the capacity of a judge, to mete out the rewards and punishments that are deserved, if any. Well, consider Christian theology, for instance. Christian theology tells us that we are all born in a condition of original sin. We sin in our lives, and we all are deserving of hell. Okay, that's a common Christian view. We all deserve hell. No one deserves salvation. But we are told God is merciful, and because he is merciful, some of us will be saved. But wait, if we all deserve hell, if we literally all deserve hell, then hell is where we should all end up if God is perfectly just. And so, yes, but he's merciful. But then he can only be unsurpassingly merciful or merciful to even the smallest degree at the expense of being perfectly just and fair and meting out the punishments we deserve, right? So there's a contradiction there. This concept of a God that is perfectly good and perfectly just, as a judge especially, is incompatible with the concept of apportioning mercy to people who don't deserve it. Because to be merciful is to relax the punishment that is deserved, and that mitigates against being perfectly just. So these concepts are inconsistent with one another. Now, you can tinker with the definition of just, you can tinker with the definition of merciful to try to get around these things, but on their face, these two concepts are incompatible. So if the God you believe in, or the God that a person believes in with whom you're speaking, says they believe that God is perfectly just and perfectly merciful, or even slightly merciful, I can say right there, no, that God as described, that God's an impossibility. As impossible as a square circle is impossible. Okay, that God is just off the table. Now, does that mean that there's no God? Well, no, maybe they've just misdescribed their God. Just like a person might hold an object in their hand and say, I have an object in my hand, and I say, what shape is it? And they say it's a square circle. They might in fact have an object in their hand. It just ain't a square circle. It can't be a square circle. So the God that they're describing, they might in fact just be misdescribing, right? But I'm an atheist with respect to the God that they're describing, right? The God that they're not describing, well, who knows? We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, okay? Now, there are many attributes of gods that are like this. A lot of the omni attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, right? Omnipresence, being atemporal. All of these concepts, I submit to you, are made up. They smack of the fictional. Why do they smack of the fictional? They're all extrapolations of ordinary mundane things, okay? For instance, we all know what it is to be a good person. We all have a sense of some idea of, who's a good person, who's a rotten person, who's a scoundrel, who's heroic and stuff like that, right? And you can just extrapolate a person's good virtues to the nth degree, and there you go. That might be your concept of omnibenevolence, okay? You can imagine how one person is more powerful, has greater capacity to do things than another, okay? You can extrapolate that, right, into the concept of infinite power. We know that there are some people who are more knowledgeable than others. You can extrapolate that and imagine a being that knows everything that is knowable, okay? And so on. All of these attributes of God, however, are not discoveries that we have made about God. It's not like God is there and we have discovered this about God. These are all things that are simply bragged about gods. We are told that the gods are powerful, that they are all good, that they are all merciful, that they are atemporal, that they are omnipresent, that they're omniscient, and so forth. These are not discoveries. These are stipulations about these gods. And when you examine some of these concepts, some of them are incoherent. The concept of omnipotence is really hard to get your head around. There's so many, we don't know what omnipotence is. omnipotence only means something to the extent that we define it. So some people define omnipotence as the capacity to do anything. Others define it as the capacity to do everything. Some people define it as the capacity to do everything that is logically possible. Other people describe it as the capacity to do everything that is logically possible and all the impossibilities too. And that's not an exaggeration. This was actually a very lively debate in the Middle Ages about God in Catholic theological circles, actually, whether or not God could do not just all possibilia, but all impossibilia. Could God do all the impossible things? So all of these concepts that are assigned or ascribed or attributed to God, these things are not discoveries that we've made about God. These are not concepts that we're actually familiar with. These are all extrapolations of ordinary mundane terms, right? Extrapolated or cantilevered out to the nth degree and then attributed to God. And the result is sometimes we don't know what we're talking about. And sometimes even when we try to get clear on a concept and get very, very specific about what we mean by a term like omnipotence, we discover that it is incompatible with another attribute of God. So, and a lot of gods have these omni-attributes because people are given to boasting about their gods. People want a God worthy of worship. And so there's a lot of, fancy talk about gods. And these generate inconsistencies, theological, internal contradictions. And when that happens, that God, as described, can't exist. No more than a square circle can exist. So that's another reason why I'm an atheist. To the extent that God concepts have been explained to me and fully articulated, they are often rife with contradictions, internal contradictions that may mean that they cannot exist as described. Okay. Then there are, so there's another, those are internal contradictions. There are also external contradiction. An external contradiction is when you have a concept of something, but there's something outside the concept that contradicts it. Okay. So for instance, I gave the example that if Yahweh exists as described in the Old Testament, then, for instance, the flight out of Egypt of the Jews, we should find evidence. Well, we don't find evidence of that. In fact, we find evidence to the contrary. The flood narrative, right? We find evidence to the contrary. There's no evidence of a global flood. On the contrary, there's evidence to the contrary. So that's not just a lack of evidence. We often find evidence that contradicts what we would predict. So that's an external contradiction. So there's the absence of evidence that you would expect to find. There's internal contradictions, and there's external contradictions. There's also the problem of more rarefied gods. Think of gods like the gods of deism, for instance, okay? Sometimes people will point to a god that is so rarefied. It's sometimes called the god of the philosophers, a god that is just a creator. It's just a mind. It brought everything into existence. It doesn't interact with the world. It doesn't talk to people. It doesn't respond to prayer. It doesn't communicate in any way with people. It has left no marks. The problem with that, of course, is that you're going to have an absence of evidence there. But that kind of God doesn't predict that there would be evidence. Okay, so here you have a lack of evidence, but you don't have a case of evidence lacking where you would expect to find it, because by hypothesis, you should not expect to find this God. This is an undetectable God, right? A lot of deists posit a kind of undetectable God, whether they intend to or not. So these more rarefied forms of God are harder to disprove in the sense that you can't find a contradiction. There's nothing in the world that contradicts them, but that's because they make no predictions, right? They are a very safe bet. They make no predictions, and so they cannot be contradicted by any data. Okay, but that also means that they are undetectable by means of any data. They are unfalsifiable gods, and hence they are undetectable gods, right? But does that mean that they don't exist? I mean, maybe, reality is just stiff with these gods. Well, the problem is this. If you have a God that is a mere or bare logical possibility with no reason to think that it's true and no predictive consequences of what we should expect to find, if it doesn't generate any predictive expectations of what you should find in the way of evidence, okay? If all you have is a bare logical possibility to hang your hat on, that's not a reason to affirm that it's even provisionally true or even plausible. Because the sheer number of these merely logical possible things is literally infinite. There could be an infinity of these gods, right? And you could ascribe any attributes you want to them, right? But they might be incompatible with one another, right? Absent any evidential basis for identifying which of the merely logically possible gods actually exist, you have no principled way to choose from among the myriad numbers of gods that you could just make up, limited only by your imagination, right? And if you try to accept them all and say, okay, well, I'll try to be open-minded and agnostic about them all, okay, you're going to end up bloating your ontology, that is your theory of what exists, to literally an infinity of mutually incompatible entities, right? So consequently, things that are merely logical possibilities can't even be provisionally accepted because there's an infinity of such hypothetical entities for which we lack evidence. And because these bare possibilities are incompatible with each other, we can't accept them all. And we have no basis other than evidence for accepting one over the other, right? You're going to have to accept them all and have this completely bloated, incoherent, mutually incompatible set of entities in your ontology, or you're going to have to reject them all provisionally and then say, well, when the evidence comes in for one of them, I'll consider that, and maybe I'll turn into a deist of that flavor. But absent any actual predictive consequences arising from that particular concept of a deity, I have no reason to accept that this thing exists. I have to provisionally reject it. So that's why I reject every flavor of deism, although I don't do so with the same stridency as I would gods that make more specific claims. One of the problems with deism and those sorts of gods of the philosophers is that they tend to be so rarefied as to be close to meaningless. I cannot imagine what a universe would look like with such a God and how it would differ if there were no such God, right? Every universe you can imagine, right? I mean, you can imagine our universe exactly as it is, or you can imagine a very different universe. All such universes could have been created by a deistic God, right? A God of deism, right? Because that concept of a deistic God, of a mind that is intelligent and creates gods but doesn't interact with it, has no particular purposes for it, and just walks away, or no specified purposes, that is compatible with any universe, not just this universe, all universes. It predicts nothing, right? So it doesn't help us understand or explain anything in the world. But the real problem there is that because it doesn't help predict any particular way that reality could be, there's no way that reality could be this way or otherwise that could point back to that deity as the cause of the reality in question. Right? So they end up being vacuous. And so I reject them all provisionally. And if someone says, here, I have a concept of a deity, of a creator God, of an intelligent mind that brought everything into existence, here are some of its attributes, here are some of its capacities, here might be some of its motives, here might be some of the means and methods by which it brought about reality, here are some telltale signs we would expect to find in a universe if it existed and was created by this being, then we could go set about looking for it. But the problem with deism, as I see it, is it generates no predictive expectations, and hence no way to falsify it, and hence no way to detect it. And the number of such deities is limited only by the fecundity of your imagination. And I'm not prepared to bloat my ontology with an indefinite number of these thin, anemic gods in order to appear open-minded. I have to reject them all provisionally.
Yeah. So, Ozzy, just on that point, why do you think that there are deists then, in the sense of why are they not atheists or agnostics and prefer deism if it's, in a sense, unfalsifiable? Isn't it an emotional attachment? Because I fail to see any good reasons or evidence for it. So why are they not atheists or agnostics?
Well, deists are deists for different reasons. I mean, I sort of dabbled in deism myself for a while, and I don't know that my sort of love affair with deism was I mean, I was an adolescent when this happened, so I wasn't the most sophisticated thinker on these matters. But my own love affair with deism at the time was motivated by a longing for there to be a God, because I was devoutly religious, and I tumbled out of my religious fundamentalism, and I was agnostic for a while. Then I would go back to it, and then agnostic for a while, and then at some point I believed that there was some kind of God, but I didn't know what this God was like. It wasn't the God of the Bible, but surely there had to be a creator. I mean, there's all this order, beauty, harmony, and patternicity, or surely this couldn't have just happened for no reason and by no cause, without an intelligence. It must be somehow directed. So I imagine that there was still an intelligence behind the universe. That, I have to say, in my case, was a holdover, an emotional attachment to the idea. But there was some rational grounding there. That is, it seemed to explain, and it really was an argument from ignorance and a God of the gaps argument on my part. But I really thought at the time that this was the best way to explain why there existed order, pattern, harmony, and so forth. I didn't know how else to explain it. And I thought that there had to be an explanation, and the only explanation I could think of was that there was an intelligence behind all of it. So that was my motivation. But I know that other deists have different motivations. Like, not everyone comes to deism sort of as a sort of a last stepping stone out of their theism into atheism, as was the case with me. A lot of people are sort of deists their whole lives. They've grown up in a home where people posit that there's a God. They look around the world, they find order, beauty, harmony, predictability, and they think, and the fact that the universe is explicable, for instance, that it's amenable to mathematics in the sciences, for instance, and they go, you know what? I think if the universe was created by an intelligence that used math and logic and so forth, then we would expect math and logic to help us understand and map reality, and that's why math works and why logic maps onto reality. I think these are actually bad arguments, and there are good arguments against that. But I think a lot of people think that there are features of reality that are best explained in terms of intelligence. In other words, the fact that the universe is itself intelligible strikes many people as pointing in the direction of an intelligent agent behind the universe in the first place. And I think that's a bad argument. I think it's a poor induction, but I think that it isn't necessarily born of any emotional attachment. I think you can sort of soberly and dispassionately think this. I still think it's a fallacious form of arguments that undergird it, but it isn't necessarily what I was going through when I tumbled out of my faith.
Good, fair enough. Perfect. Okay, there aren't any questions about that. So if you want to continue on, that's great.
Okay, well, there's another thing that I wanted to touch on, and that is the sort of the origin of religious concepts. There are certain facts that we know about us. We know that we're pattern-seeking creatures, right? And everyone knows that, you look in the clouds, we see faces in the clouds, we see shapes and things like that. We are pattern-seeking, pattern-identifying creatures. We're also very much given to ascribing or attributing intentional mental content to things. People get frustrated at their cars when they won't start, and they bang on the dash or on the steering wheel with their car won't start. Why? Because they're angry. Why? Because they're angry at the car. Why would you be angry at a piece of machinery? It doesn't make sense. It's because we are just naturally disposed to treat things that are frustrating us the way we would trust an agent that was frustrating us, right? We do this all the time with our laptops and our TVs and things like that, right? We treat them as if they were agents. We treat inanimate objects like this all the time. There are entire forms of religion called animism, where people believe that everything in the natural world and even the unnatural world is animated, has a spirit, has a soul in it. Okay, it's the doctrine of animism. So we are sort of naturally disposed to do this, right? When you know this about us, that should set off some alarm bells. Somehow we are psychologically like this. Well, why should this be? Well, I mean, consider when you're playing a chess playing computer. You sit down and play chess with your laptop, okay? Do you ask yourself, I wonder what's going on in the logic gates. I wonder what's going on in the programming. No. When you play chess with your computer, in order to beat it, you say to yourself, uh-oh, if I do this, the computer is going to see that I'm setting a trap. And I bet you it's willing to sacrifice a pawn for a rook. And so if I do that, I'm going to lose my queen. So I won't do that. All the way through, when you're playing your chess playing computer, you're treating it exactly like it's an intelligent agent. You are assuming that it values certain pieces over others. You're assuming it has objectives, namely to get you into checkmate, and that it has sub-goals and sub-goals, that it's willing to make sacrifices and unwilling to make other sacrifices, that it has certain desires. So to say that it has goals and desires, and that it perceives the moves on the board, that it anticipates a move you're going to make, that it's setting a trap, all of this is attributing intentionality, attributing mental content to the computer. Now, of course, the computer doesn't actually have those. It's not actually having those mental experiences, but this is just what we do. Now, why do we do this? Well, it's because we're a social species. We are not solitary spiders who live in a web alone. And, once our eggs hatch, we don't come into contact with spiders except to mate and kill any other spiders that come anywhere near our web. We're not those kinds of creatures. We are the creatures that we are. And the kind of critters that we are is a social species. And as a social species, we are interested in knowing what others think of us, managing our reputations, making sure that we form friendships and allies, and avoid making needless enemies, and guarding against enemies, and securing resources, making friendships, falling in love, seducing. All of this is incredibly social, okay? It's all very transactional, but all of it rests on a capacity to read minds. And I don't mean anything supernatural. I just mean the ability to look at a person's behavior and hear their words and figure out, speculate what their intentions are. And we're incredibly good at this. We're incredibly good at it. I mean, children are projecting intentions onto their teddy bears and toys all the time. They learn to read our intentions. They figure out very quickly that lying works and things like that. And tattling can on their siblings and stuff like that can earn them some advantages and stuff like that. They learn when to say "I love you" when they've done something bad in order to endear themselves to us, so that our hearts break and then we just forgive them immediately and stuff like that. They're very good at manipulating us. We're all like this. This is the chimp in us. This is the social primate in us. Because we are social primates, we are naturally good at reading minds. But the capacity to read a mind means that you have a capacity to project onto the behavior of something that it has mental states. This is something that we do. This is why I think animism exists, for instance. Now, knowing this fact about us and our psychology, this should give us pause when people say that they were in a natural environment and had a certain experience and think it was God talking to them, or they have a certain experience that they don't know how to identify and attribute it to a God, right? We are always looking for meaning and significance and purpose in the behavior of things around us, including our own internal states. We just do this automatically. We don't turn this system on. It's always running, which is why when you look up at the clouds, you can see a face. You weren't looking for one, you just saw one there, because that system doesn't go offline, it's always running. In fact, it's only in cases like people that are sort of severely autistic and have other conditions where these capacities seem to be offline and not running that we notice, oh, there's something wrong. We don't seem to be able to read people's behaviors and intentions properly. Something's wrong. So it is sort of natural for us to read agency, purpose, design, and motive into things around us. And we do it for the natural world. We'll say something like, my lawn is thirsty. Well, what am I saying? Well, I'm just saying it hasn't rained in a while, and I'm describing my lawn's capacity to absorb water, okay? But we're always using intentionalistic, mentalistic idioms in talking about things. And I think we're just given to do this about the entire cosmos. We imagine that all of reality has to have a purpose. has to have come into existence for a reason, that there must be a reason for our own lives. The whole of our lives must have a reason. There must be some purpose. I think this is a mistake. I think that this is this system that we have that is running online constantly, sort of being applied where it serves no function. But when you sort of appreciate that fact about humanity, it's wildly unsurprising that we would make up stories about beings that control the natural forces. You know, why was there an earthquake? Why was there a storm? Why was there a flood? Why was there a bad harvest? Oh, the gods are angry, right? I mean, in the ancient pagan world, for instance, there wasn't just a god like Yahweh. I mean, in pagan polytheistic religions, there were thousands of gods, right? There were the gods of your city-state, for instance, right? The classical polytheistic gods, but there was also your ancestors. There was ancestor worship. You believe that they continued to exist long after they were dead. But there was also the natural gods. Every river, every stream, every forest had gods in them. Okay, that infused them. Okay, this is just a something that we naturally do. It is natural for us to do this, to project the mental onto the whole of the world, and parts of the world and the world writ large. And so it's not surprising to me that we are disposed to be religious, and then some of these ideas come to be systematized.
Would one also add to that the fact that where we didn't have explanations for these in the past, and we would have looked at deities and so on, our scientific achievements and progress has pushed back on that. So we now have explanations for what we could have or possibly did think were, you know, the deity was a source of some of these events.
Yeah, I'm not trying to suggest that religions only exist to explain the inexplicable, although they do that. That is just, I mean, you can look at the history of religions, and it's like a long tale of confabulations trying to explain why historical events unfolded a certain way, why a person lived or died, why something happened to your city, why something happened in your life. Theistic explanations for all of these things sort of come naturally to us. Humans do, in fact, try to explain things this way, but I don't think that is the only or principal function of religion or religiosity. I think that it's more a matter of we just naturally project this onto the world. It's not because we're consciously trying to explain things. I think we just automatically have a kind of default explanation for things, and that default explanation is there's a mind behind it, there's an intelligence behind it, there's a purpose behind it, there's a goal behind it. Okay, but certainly when you look at in the full sweep of history, you can read the history of religions and mythologies as a series of failures to explain things that have been since subsequently better explained or correctly explained through scientific models. Everything, from lightning to earthquakes to disease and pestilence and all the rest of it. And I think religions have had to sort of withstand a fairly relentless and withering series of attacks for centuries now, at least since the Enlightenment, of having better and better explanations for phenomena that used to be only explicable in terms of the divine. I mean, just look at the New Testament, right? I mean, you have people there who are evidently mad, who are described as being demon possessed. Right. I mean, demonic possession was seen for a while as, not always throughout history, but in Europe for quite a while, demonic possession was seen as the best explanation for madness. Right. They were effectively synonymous. It took a while for these two concepts to become uncoupled. Right. So yeah, we have seen a pretty striking blow dealt against the religious way of thinking and looking at the world because of science. Theologies don't explain much, and they don't explain much in part because they don't discover much. They simply attribute purposes and intentions and desires and goals and objectives to things going on around us. When they posit a specific God, they don't discover any facts about that God. Everything that we know about Yahweh or any of the Abrahamic faiths, for instance, that God of the Abrahamic faiths, everything there is not discovered. Everything there is, on the contrary, everything there is stipulated. Whatever you say about God, whether you say he's perfectly just or merciful or wrathful or jealous or did this thing or did that thing, everything there is stipulated. There is nothing about any God that has ever been discovered that you can point to and say, we discovered this fact about God. If God is atemporal or merely eternal, that is outside of time or merely always existing in time, what are we to say about that, about God in that respect? Is he eternal, having always existed and always will exist, or is he atemporal, completely outside of time, right? Because time came into existence, as we now come to think in terms of physics, right? These are different conceptions of God. We used to describe God as being eternal. Now theologians like to talk to, and apologists like to talk about God as atemporal. Why? Well, because time itself seems to have come into existence. So to say that God is eternal is merely to say he's always existed as long as there was time. Time used to be imagined as never having had a beginning, but now we think that time had a beginning as part of space-time. So now they have to imagine God as somehow outside of time, whatever the heck that means. Look, if God is eternal or was eternal, we didn't discover that fact. And now the concept of God with respect to time is being changed. Theologians now like to think of God as being atemporal, outside of time, because our concept of time has changed. We didn't discover that fact about God. We discovered a fact about time, and now we have to change how we talk about God. Nothing that we know about God is discovered. It's all invention. And in other words, and this sort of brings me back to the point I was trying to get at the beginning of this, which is because everything that is said about God is stipulated, is simply declared in some storybook or from the pen of some theologian or apologist, because everything about God has that character, it is no different than the powers of Superman. What are Superman's powers? They are not to be discovered. Superman's powers are invented. They're invented by the authors who wrote the Superman comic books and make the Superman movies now, okay? And it seems to me that if you have a hypothetical being or a positive being, like a God, that has certain attributes, these attributes are manifest nowhere else in the world. They seem to be extrapolations to the nth degree of ordinary mundane features of the world. Like, being omnipotent and omniscient and so forth, right? If those are merely attributed and not discovered, there's no more reason to think that God is real and is omnipotent than to think that Superman, if he flies fast enough against the spin of the Earth, could reverse the spin of the Earth and set back time. That's a power that Superman has. I know, I saw it in a movie, okay? But it's not true. Right? It is a purported power of Superman. All of God's powers, capacities are purported. They are stipulated. And that's true of every God. And this is a reason for your BS detectors to be going off. Nothing about God is discovered. Then it has the character of a comic book character. It smacks of fiction, right? Couple that with the fact that when you read the stories, they seem quaint. They are so fantastical. You don't have to reject the whole Bible. You can read the Bible and go, oh, this could have happened. This makes sense. Oh, this part here, completely fantastical. I don't believe that this happened. This makes no sense, right? And then you can look in history and see what happened and what didn't. And some of those things that are described in the Old Testament, for instance, happened. Some things in the Qur'an that are described might have happened. Some things not. You don't have to accept it all or reject it all. You can do what a historian does, and when they read the Iliad or the Odyssey, they don't treat it all as inerrant history, nor do they treat it all as complete worthless fiction. They can look at each part as they go through and go, oh, this is plausible. That might make sense. And other parts, that makes no sense. That's a fantastical tale. And has nothing to do with a prejudice against the supernatural. When I look at a James Bond movie, there's all kinds of fantastical stuff going down in those movies. That I go, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. That's ridiculous. I don't believe that could happen, right? But it isn't because there's magic in those movies. There's no magic in those movies. There's just fantastical things, right? And so you don't have to have a prejudice against the supernatural to find these stories implausible and to find them quaint. They just have to be fantastical in character and not born of any evidence. And that's enough to say, I don't believe this God. This God is the stuff of fiction. It smells of fiction all the way through.
Good. Is there, before we carry on, is there any other reasons? Because I want to just ask you about a couple of reasons that I've heard and that people talk about for disbelieving in a God, but I want to make sure that you've covered all the reasons that you would, or that you would say to people you're an atheist, as you've currently done. Is there any more outstanding from your side that you would present?
No, I mean, everything else that I would say would be sort of a more specific character addressing a specific God and a specific claim about a God and so forth. But let me summarize it here and very quickly why I think atheism, the claim that there aren't any gods, is more likely to be true than not. Okay, how do you discharge this burden? You just point to the lack of evidence where evidence ought to be found. You can point to internal contradictions within these theologies and within these God concepts. You could point to external contradictions, actual things that are true in the world which contradict what we should expect to find. Not merely failing to find certain things, but actually contradictory things that we find in archaeology, for instance, right? In the absence of all that, you can point out that something being a mere bare logical possibility isn't a reason for even provisionally accepting it as true. There's an infinity of these things, and so you have to provisionally reject them or else bloat your ontology. So those would be sort of the four reasons that I think capture practically every God concept in every religion and why we could reject them. And lastly, just look at the nature of the stories. Look at where they originated. Look at human nature and the dispositions that we have, and you will see that it is no more surprising that we should invent gods than we should be surprised by the fact that children have invisible friends, talk to their teddy bears, and that we posit fairies, elves, selkies, griffins, manticores, Bigfoot, dragons. All of these things at some point in some cultures have been believed in. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these sorts of things, all right? Are we surprised by the fecundity of human imagination that we could come up with these fictional entities? No. Any such hypothetical being is more likely to be BS than not. The only thing that should ever make you think, oh, wait, I need to be agnostic about this, or I need to believe this, is if there's evidence. And absent any reason to even be so far as going agnostic, I'm going to be an atheist and say, no, these concepts don't make sense. They smack of invention. They smell like the artifacts of human imagination. And as a result, I have to provisionally reject them. And I think that's in fact how most atheists proceed, for the reasons that I just gave. Those are essentially the 5 reasons.
So you don't even need to get into things like unnecessary suffering and so forth. We can simply go with what you've talked about here, separately from some of those other reasons.
Well, unnecessary suffering would fall under one of the categories. For instance, unnecessary suffering. If you posit a God, if you posit a malevolent God, then there's no problem explaining why there's all this misery in the world, right? It's not a surprise. If the creator of the universe is malevolent and hates human beings and is either indifferent to their suffering or enjoys their suffering, then the existence of suffering is not a problem, okay? The existence of suffering, the problem of suffering, okay, is a problem if you posit a being that is omnibenevolent and all-powerful and all-knowing, right? If God knows everything, can do anything, and would only do the right thing, then we would not predict that there is suffering, right? It's not the world we would expect to find, this world that we're in, if that God existed. So either there isn't any suffering, well, there is, Or that God doesn't have all of those attributes. Either he's not omnibenevolent, or maybe he's omnibenevolent, but he didn't know that this would happen, in which case he's not omniscient, or he's not omnipotent and he can't prevent it, right? But that tri-omni God, that is inconsistent with the existence of suffering, even one tier. It doesn't make sense, right? And so there is an external contradiction, right? You can just bracket whether or not those three attributes even go together internally, whether they're internally consistent. You can just point to the external contradiction that there's suffering in the world. That doesn't jive with this God that has these three omni attributes. That's an external contradiction. So practically all of the objections to specific arguments can be subsumed under either there's a lack of evidence where we'd expect to find it, there's an internal contradiction, there's an external contradiction, you're just describing an unfalsifiable bare possibility that we can dismiss as provisionally false. And then you couple that with some knowledge about human nature and human psychology and the kinds of stories that people are telling, that tells you that these sound like human confabulations. And practically every apologetical argument that can be put forward to you can be subsumed under one of these reasons that I've given for atheism. They practically everything falls into one of these categories.
Good, that's a nice summary. There is a question here that's perhaps not quite on that topic, although it is from a theist point of view, and it's one you've touched on before, but I think it is one that is quite useful, and it comes from somebody here who says, and I've heard this before, and I think you have talked about it, but perhaps you can talk about it again. How do atheists account for rationality without using rationality?
Well, the question is ill-posed. If you ask me to do a handstand without using my hands, you're asking me a dumb question. I don't account for rationality without using my rationality. The way you account for anything rationally is using your rational faculties. So no, I don't. I don't make the mistake of trying to argue in a circle. People who try to argue for the existence of their the rationality of their faculties or the reliability of their cognitive faculties without assuming them are going to find it impossible, right? But positing a God doesn't help. Positing that there exists a God that is rational and is the guarantor of the reliability of your rational faculties doesn't help. How did you establish that God exists? What faculties did you use? Did you use your rationality while you were trying to establish whether or not a rational God existed that serves as the guarantor of your rationality? No one has a way out of this problem, right? If I ask you to tell me, what's in this cup, is it water, yes or no? But you're not allowed to use language. Well, what are you going to use, right? Well, I'm sorry, but I'm stacking the deck. If a person asks me to give a rational defense of something, then I have to be able to use reason. If I'm not allowed to use reason, what do you want from me? You want an irrational reason? So when people ask you something like that, like, how do you establish that your faculties are rational, or how do you ground rationality? I don't think anything grounds rationality. I think rationality has causes, but there isn't a meta-rational reason for why reason works. That is only going to be a circular argument. That is, you're going to be using the very thing that's in question, namely your rational faculties, to justify trust in your rational faculties. And so you can't do that. That would be irrational. So the person is asking you to give a rational defense of your position, but don't use reason. Well, I'm sorry. Do you want me to be reasonable or unreasonable? Right? If you want me to be reasonable, I will tell you the truth. I don't think that there is a rational way to ground my rationality without using my rationality in the process of it. Right? Rationality is a way to think of rationality is what you use to arrive at all your other beliefs. You don't arrive at the rationality of your rational faculties using your rational faculties because you're arguing in a circle. So think of rationality as a ladder. rationality is the ladder that you climb to arrive at your other beliefs, to reach what you want, to reach the truth. Okay? You don't climb a ladder to reach the ladder that you're already on. That doesn't make sense. So that would be my answer there. That the question itself is actually ill-posed. It's actually an incoherent question. Ask the person who asks you that, do you want me to give you a rational answer or an irrational answer? Because if they say a rational answer, oh, well then, if you want a rational answer, then presumably you want me to use my rational faculties, right? So that's a kind of presuppositionalist trick that's gotten popular in recent years, is to try to trick a person into saying that they can ground their rational faculties without using their rational faculties. I mean, that works on someone who doesn't know any epistemology. But if anyone has studied some epistemology, they'll know, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. You're asking me for something incoherent here. You're asking me to give a rational account of a non-rational process that's going to ground my rationality. No, there's not going to be such a thing. It doesn't make any sense. So I think rationality arises historically and evolutionarily for certain reasons. There are causal reasons for why this happens. There's a causal account, but there isn't going to be an epistemological warrant or justification for it. I think rather what we have are causal processes that result in our rational faculties, and we then use the rational faculties to warrant everything else, but we can't warrant them. That would argue in a circle.
Perfect. I want to welcome in the realistic nihilist. Before I go to you, sir, I think stop spamming, and my co-panelist Abu had a question, and then we'll pass over to the realistic nihilist before we close out. So stops, or Abu, if you got a question you wanted to ask Ozzy.
Okay, then I'll go first, and you have time to think about it, because mine is very is very quick, and I can't think what I wanted to know. Oh, if you look at the discussions with theists at the moment, do you agree that most of them are not arguing for their God any longer, but are actually arguing for the belief in the belief?
Yeah, well, that does go on. I think most of the theists that I've had discussions with really do try to argue for their God, or at least try to argue that atheism is irrational, and that you at least have to posit an intelligent creator. But there is also, I think, what motivates more naive would-be apologists or more naive theists, a conviction that it is important to believe, and that, I think, motivates a lot of people. They just think it's important that you believe, and something terrible is going to go wrong with you if you don't believe, and they don't understand how you can't see the value of belief, and it sometimes inspires them to put forward things like Pascal's wager and that sort of thing. Is that what you're getting at? Is it that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. That was the answer. Yeah, because I made this observation. I just wanted to know if I'm alone on this planet looking at this, but yeah, that's what I see.
Yeah, well, Daniel Dennett has certainly expounded on that a bit. He says that there's a lot of people who believe what they believe, but there's a lot of people who just believe in belief, who think it's important that you believe in something. And if you don't, the wheels will fall off of the cart of civilization, right?
Why do I always think I'm the first one to notice these things?
Well, he talks about it in a book called Breaking the Spell. He goes
no,
on.
Come on. He's known this for years now?
Yes.
Abu, do you want to pose a question, and then we'll pass over to the realistic nihilist?
Yes. During the Easter, I was listening to lectures with Bart Ehrman about like early Christian sects. And one of the sects was the Gnostics. And they exist. They're not only, it's a larger kind of philosophy than just Christian. There is a Christian branch to it. And they had this belief that this world, this material world that we live in here, is created by a kind of an evil God. But there is a more true God outside that God that is kind of separate from the imperfect God that created this world. And I mean, that's interesting from a kind of epistemological point of view, like, is it possible to prove or disprove that view? Like, because I can't really see, like, if they are claiming that there is another kind of dimension God, in another kind of God outside the God that you don't even have to believe that there is a God that created this world. You can also just pose that this world is material, but outside this reality, there also exists this kind of higher dimension in which the true God exists. So I just want, is there a epistemological way to face that question?
I don't know. I'm sort of struggling with how to understand the question. I know a little bit about Gnosticism, and yeah, you're right. It was this view that there was a creator God, but he was not a good God. He just had to be obeyed. All you could do was sort of obey him, but there was no salvation. And there was no pleasing him. That you could at best propitiate this God, but they believed that they were in possession of secret knowledge, hence Gnostics. They were the knowers. They were the keepers of a secret tradition that most people had forgotten. Most people had forgotten that we are gods, and that we partake of the divine, and that this world is a world that you really want to get out of. It's not a good world. It's kind of an ugly world, and sort of the best thing to do is sort of get out of this world at some point and transcend it, and sort of be reunited in some other realm. And Gnostic Christians were of a slightly different view. They were of the view that, yeah, there was this God, sort of like the Old Testament God, and he's an okay God, but there's no pleasing him. There's really no satisfying him. There's just too many rules. He's an implacable God. He's a vengeful God, but then there's this Jesus character who is this redeemer God, and we can sort of get out of the black fate that faces us by worshiping this God, who is a truer God and who is our benefactor. So the creator God is not our benefactor, right? But Jesus is our benefactor. But I mean, if you're sort of thinking about, like, well, it's sort of these different ontological realms of deities. I mean, let me give you sort of a deistic kind of scenario. Let's imagine that the world that we're in is like the Matrix. Imagine that the world that we're in is in fact a simulated world. Okay, we don't realize it, but we're all simulations in a computer. And the creator of our world, okay, is some guy. It's just some guy at a computer. He created the whole world, and here we are in it, conscious beings in a simulated world. It feels real and physical to us, but that's just what goes on in a simulation. You think the simulation is real. Now, the creator of that world isn't necessarily concerned with you. He's concerned with the world. We're just Sims in a simulation, right? He's not concerned with our particular fate. He doesn't care if we live or die. He doesn't care if we pray. There's no way to communicate with that, right? The Sims can't communicate with you when you're playing, Sim Life or something like that, right? Well, I guess Sim Life's not the right game. That's another game. But anyway, so if we exist in a simulation, you could think of the creator of the simulation as the God. It's the intelligent mind that created the world and created you in it. But that God doesn't have to be concerned with you. But there could be something in his world, another person in his world who is concerned with you, who might be your benefactor, who might be saying, hey, listen, we need to reprogram this game here. Your creations are suffering in this simulated world. Your Sims are suffering, buddy, right? And maybe he wants to communicate with us, and maybe we want to communicate with him. Maybe he's feeding us some information, right? So, I mean, if you want to get sort of, sort of weirdly, extravagantly metaphysical and or sci-fi, it's not hard to imagine deities that are unconcerned with us, that created us and created all of the world. I mean, the idea that we're intelligent creations isn't a stupid idea, right? On its face, it's not a stupid idea, right? I just don't think there's any good arguments in support of it, but at least nothing conclusive anyway. Nothing that would move me out of my atheism, even into agnosticism on it. But it's certainly possible to imagine, to coherently imagine a realm outside of ours where there exist intelligent beings that created us, that are or are not concerned with us, right? And all you have to do is think of us as a simulation, and there you have it, right? You posited an intelligently created world, our world, a matrix, a simulation. And there you have it.
What I think, if you go with the simulation argument there, I mean, the simulator is one thing, but according to the Gnostics, like at least some people have this spark from this other kind of this super god that is purely spirit. So that would be some kind of a spirit that is outside the realm of the guy with the computer that is simulating us or something, if you could go with that simile. And then
Yeah. I was just going to say, I don't know if the Gnostic Christians believe that or not, or if that was a pagan Gnostic tradition, because I know that there existed both. And I think that the Gnostic Christianity is a phenomenon of the 2nd century, that is 2nd century AD, whereas pagan Gnosticism preceded that. But I don't know enough about the two to be able to say.
According to Bart Ehrman, it's more like it is a Jewish tradition, despite you might think that it is not. I mean, I think it's kind of similar to Buddhism also, which have this that now we are in the realm of samsara, and if you through meditation and practice, you can go outside this realm to a nirvana. I see some similarities there, but I still that. According to them, some people, not a lot of people, are like animals to them, that they have no consciousness, or to the extent they have consciousness, that consciousness ends with this, when this life ends. But some have this kind of divine spark from this super god realm, the perfect realm. So I guess, is it possible to disprove that? I can't really see how you could do it.
No, I wouldn't disprove it. I think that there's nothing that speaks for it, and it sounds confabulated and made up. Everything that you have described there sounds like a sheer stipulation of facts not found in evidence, and it speaks to certain deep longings in human nature, right? A deep longing to not die, to persist, to exist. The doctrine that death is ultimately an illusion, that there is some grand purpose for oneself, that there will be justice ultimately. I mean, think of the concept of karma, for instance. There are people who believe in resurrection, not resurrection, but reincarnation and the karmic wheel and so forth, right? What are those? I mean, those are just other ways of imagining that we don't really die, that life continues, some spark of us continues into the next life, and that ultimately, because of karma, justice will be done, right? We long for justice, we long to continue living, we fear death. I mean, and religions have a habit of sort of promising everything that you want. And that's why I think you have to sort of be wary of this. Right away, your BS detector should be ringing. Something like deism, I think, is actually largely immune to that, because deists have a tendency to stay away from anything that smacks of a promise of what a human being would want to be true. And that, I think, fairly immunizes them from a lot of this objection of mind that most religions smack of confabulation.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, maybe we should let the other.
We're coming up to 2 hours, and I want to respect Ozzy's time, but Josh, aka TRN, is in, and I think he wanted to add a few words, or perhaps have a comment with or to Ozzy. So go ahead, sir.
Yeah. So I guess from what I heard, there are only there are two things. There are two things I think are missing from some of the dialectics. One of the things I think is missing from the dialectic is a sort of philosophically interesting definition of a god, right? So on my view, I think that there are things in the concept of God that are of philosophical import, right? And so I think that those are notions like a disembodied mind and omnipotence and omniscience and things like that. When you're loose with the definition of what can be considered a god, I mean, like on some definitions of a god, I'm a theist, like if I believe that my computer is a god, then I'm a theist, right? Big whoop. There's nothing that really hinges on a semantic dispute. And so I think for all of the philosophically important notions of God, I'm a strong atheist in the sense that I don't think gods are possible, and I think that you can give good arguments for that. And so I think that that was missing. I think it's important to question, well, why are we calling simply something that's more powerful than us a god? I mean, certainly, there are humans who are more powerful than you are as an individual. We don't call them God, and it just seems like it reaches an arbitrary point at which you say, oh, well, like if I can throw lightning bolts, then that's a god, right? Like, why is that a criterion? And so I think that if there's not specific philosophical criteria for defining a god, then it's not really, it's sort of just a semantic game, right? Whether or not you're a theist or not a theist. But if there is something of philosophical import to the notion of God, then I think that it makes sense to say that you're an atheist in the strong sense, and that you think that gods are impossible, and that maybe you can be certain of it. I mean, obviously, certainty is a sort of epistemic notion. So, like, oh, there might be some facts I'm unaware of, right? There might be a good argument out there that exists, but as of right now, I think that I can confidently say that there are no gods, right? And so I thought that that was missing from your exposition. And another thing is that you characterize, this might be very minor, but you sort of characterized it as a problem about giving justification for your rationality, right? But I think it's actually a mischaracterization to call something a problem, because problems I don't think are meaningful without solutions, right? And so solutions are states of affairs towards which we're directed, right? But if there are no possible states of affairs that to which we can be directed, I don't think it makes sense to have an obstacle in the way of that direction, right? So I take problem to be something like an obstacle in the way of that direction. But if you can't be directed towards something, so I think your view is correct. You can't be directed towards something like a handstand with no hands, right? You can't be directed towards a justification for the possibility of justification. And so I think it's just a confusion to call those sorts of things a problem. And so that's my 2 cents. That's all I wanted to mention.
Okay, let me take the first one first about the semantics of God. God is a word with a history. All right, so most of the people in this discussion are going to be concerned with Abrahamic gods, which is why most of what I've had to say has sort of touched on that or used examples from the Abrahamic faiths. But unfortunately, there have been other lesser gods. And that word has always been used to refer to lesser gods. Zeus is a lesser god. He's not an omnipotent. Excuse me for a moment. I'm sorry. I'm getting a message here. I beg your pardon. Sorry about that. An important message from my wife. I'm almost out of time. There's my god.
Yes, I was just about to say that.
Yeah, I suppose I should say goddess. So the word God is a word with a history. So Zeus was a god, okay. All right, so he hurled thunderbolts around, stuff like that. Well, he didn't just hurl thunderbolts. He was a massively powerful being, right? But there were even lesser gods, right? And then the ancient Greeks had concepts of gods like strife was a god, right? And rosy-fingered dawn was a goddess. Right, things like that. I mean, they're for them, the concept of a god was just a supernatural being that had governance over some part of the world. It could even be a very small part of the world. It could be a pond in a forest, right? So the word God gets used all over the place in most of the discourse within the Great Debate. We're talking about the Abrahamic gods. But yes, Josh, I completely take your point. We want to specify what we mean by a god. So what do I mean by a god? Well, in this discussion, what I have been sort of imagined in the back of my mind was an intelligent being that is responsible for the world, either through some direct or indirect act of creation of all or part of it, and it's a being of sufficient power to do at least that. And that's it. And so, I mean, it's possible that we could discover that a God was really ultimately a very natural thing. It doesn't have to be tied to a supernatural phenomenon. I mean, if we found ourselves, if it turned out to be the case that we were in a matrix, that there was something akin to a teenager in a basement room with some kind of computer beyond our imaginings, that had created and simulated everything around us, including us, that thing would be relative to us a god. It would rival anything that Yahweh could do. I mean, he could literally program anything to happen, right? He could program things to happen that we could only describe as miraculous relative to our capacities, right? So I think that would be a worthwhile concept of God. But now what we would have is a non-supernatural empirical God. I mean, gods could exist. I'm not someone who thinks that you can argue against God, for instance, by saying God is supernatural, the supernatural doesn't exist, therefore God doesn't exist, right? And I don't think you would argue that way either, but that is a move that a lot of people want to make. And I'm agnostic when it comes to ontological categories. Could a God exist? Of course a God could exist. A God could exist in exactly the sense that I just described. Yahweh could be a teenager in a basement with a supercomputer that simulated us and the world around us. That doesn't strike me as logically impossible. It wasn't even conceivable until we had computers and could simulate things. And we don't know how it would be possible to simulate a conscious being, for instance, such that the beings really were conscious, such as we are. But it's not an impossibility. I can't think of an argument why it couldn't be the case. And that, in my view, would be as real a God and as full-bodied a God as anything supernatural or described in the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah, so I'm not understanding, like, when you have an ontological criterion, that's the point at which you have some non-arbitrary epistemic, like, reason for it's something decisive for stipulating what a God is, right? But on your view, when there's not an ontological distinction between a God and a non-God, it just becomes sort of like an arbitrary, oh, well, I might call this a God, right? It's not.
I don't think it's arbitrary, because for me, it's a question of relative power and governance. I like the fact that the ancient Greeks had this idea of gods of streams and fields and things like that, and the dawn and stuff like that. That these things could be gods. They personified these things, right? And what made them gods, as opposed to natural critters, was that they seemed otherworldly. You couldn't just interact with them in some mundane manner. They were not ordinary critters like ourselves, and they had governance over something. And so, the great programmer or architect that programmed our simulation, if we are in one, that I think would be meaningfully a God for that reason. You have an intelligent mind that is responsible for what we find ourselves in, and has enormous power and governance over it. It doesn't bother me that it's not in some other ontological realm. The ontology seems to me irrelevant.
Well, I mean, so, like, it seems to me like you're categorizing it in terms of relations, right? But that might mean something like, if ants are conscious, then relative to ants, we are gods,
Well, I mean, this is not to say that, I mean, supposing there was a conscious ant, there's an intelligent, an incredibly intelligent ant, okay? And he looks around and he looks at us and our capacity to, like, wipe out their anthills and decides that, well, we're like gods. Well, I think that ant is going to be mistaken, right? That ant is just not in possession of all of the facts. He's in possession of some of the relevant relational facts, namely that we have enormous power and governance over it, but we didn't create that. Even if I built an ant farm, okay, I don't think I would be I could be playing the role of a god for that ant, but knowing what I know about how I'm related to that creature, actually biologically related through ancestry, through common ancestry, I know that I just have ants as pets and I'm not a god. And that ant would be mistaken, right? Now, a counter to my argument here is what you could come back as well. Maybe the architect who created the simulation that we're in, whom we regard as a god, just regards us as pets. We're like, we're like his ant farm, right? And maybe he understands some facts about our relationship, but it seems to me that he really did create us and really did create this world. He isn't just in this world with us, that the architect actually created us. And so while he might regard us as pets, we are pets of his making. And that's not the same with ants. We didn't make the ants, and we didn't make the world that the ants are in. We just share a world with them, and we have enormous power over them. And now with respect to the Greek gods, we might discover that the Greek gods did exist, and we might discover that they are exactly like us, that they just share the world with us, and they just have power over us the way I have power over an ant farm, in which case they're just critters like us. They're enormously powerful, and we don't have to think of their governance over something as anything special. I mean, that could turn out to be, right? But it seems to me that if the ancient Greek gods and Yahweh are in the same relation to the world and us as the architect who created the matrix is, then those are really gods, and those are gods worthy of the word gods. Whereas if the Greek gods are just critters in the world like we are, that have power over a part of the world that affects us, then that's just like me owning an ant farm, in which case they're not gods. We've just mistaken them for gods.
So you think that if you like molecularly reconstructed a series of ants, then you would be a god relative to those ants?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. No, it's not that they created us. It's that the God sort of has to be responsible for the creation of that feature of reality that we're talking about. So the architect of the matrix, for instance, didn't just create us. He didn't just reorganize some matter in his world to create a creature akin to him. He's created a notional world, right? A world that utterly unlike himself. And it exists only in the simulation. We exist only in the simulation, and he created the whole world, the whole simulation. I mean, that is like Yahweh creating the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a scoping issue there, because I mean, there's probably this is probably why I'm saying I think that there has to be an ontological notion, because even with the stuff that you're talking about, I think that there's a world in which that God is situated, whatever that may be, right? You were talking about a person at a computer, etc., right? And that world operates in a law-like fashion, and so in some sense, we are part of that world, right?
Yeah, and well, we're nested in that world. Yeah.
And so,
yeah. But the laws of physics could be completely different there, right?
Yeah, but I don't see how that's. I mean, I'm not sure if that's a really substantive difference. We're still governed by the laws of physics of that other world, right? It's just that that other world. So let's say anything that's nomologically impossible in that world, we're not, and we have some effects of that. That's not going to be possible in this world. Right. And so I don't think.
Well, look at it this way, like. I mean, the fellow who creates the matrix can't enter our world. He can affect things in our world. He can communicate with us, but he can't enter our world, and we can't enter his, right? I mean, if you wanted an ontological difference, that's a bigger ontological difference between us and the architect of the matrix than between us and Yahweh, right? I mean, if you want an ontological difference, that's as great a one as I can think of. He literally can't enter our world. All he could do is simulate himself in the world, right? But he wouldn't even be, he'd still be out there.
We might have to, if you have to go soon, we might have to table.
Yeah, I think we'll do that. We'll go to an after show, Josh, and you can carry on, because I want to respect Ozzy's time, and I know his goddess was calling there as well. So Ozzy, I want to thank you so much for coming on, for sharing that. I'm going to keep this. Obviously, if you'd like a copy, you're more than welcome. We will go to an after show, and I'll send a link to the chat for anybody who wants to join us. But a huge thank you to you. Obviously, if you're available again at some point, we'll chat again. But I want to thank you and respect your time, and that's been awesome. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to your listeners.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ozzy. Take care.
Thanks, Ozzy.
We'll carry
Before
on
you
now.
go offline, can I just say something?
Yeah, please.
Okay, there's a couple of things, because while we are going on, life is carrying on. One thing I do want to show in all, I want to be very clear on this. This Punish a Muslim Day is a joke, it's satire, but it's really stupid. Okay, because we have a lot of very stupid people, a lot of very violent people who are going to do stupid things. And this is why I strongly condemn Punish a Muslim Day, even if it was intended as a joke or something. The second thing is good news. There's good news too. Saudi Arabia, a crown prince has said that Israel has a right to its own country. Now, this for me is groundbreaking. This for me is really brilliant, and it shows that there can be movement even when we do not expect it. Thanks. That's all I want to say.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Ozzy. Very much appreciate you being on. And we'll pop into an after show now. If you want to join, I will make the link available in the chat.
Very nice.
Which one do I need now? I want to end the broadcast.